This week on Quadriga, state elections in Germany, D-Day for Merkel. Voters in 3 German states go to the polls this Sunday. Many consider this a referendum on Chancellor Merkel's refugee policy. Merkel's Christian Democrats are growing nervous. She's promised to find a European solution to the refugee crisis, but she hasn't found one yet. That was clear from Monday's EU-Turkey summit in Brussels. Merkel will address the refugee crisis later this month at an EU summit, but time is running out. The number of refugees arriving in Germany has fallen recently, but that's not good enough for some voters. Many experts are predicting big gains for right-wing populist parties in this Sunday's state elections. Will this be D-Day for Merkel? Coming to you from Berlin, Quadriga, the international debate. Your host this week, Melinda Crane.
Hello and welcome. Will Germany's Super Sunday add up to a verdict on Chancellor Merkel's refugee policy? And if so, will a possible EU-Turkey deal be enough to calm anxious voters? That's what we want to talk about today with 3 guests who've been following events here in Germany very closely. It's a pleasure to welcome Dilek Kurban. She's the Marie Curie Fellow at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin, and she also writes a column for the Turkish daily newspaper Milliyet. She thinks conceding to an illiberal regime for fear of domestic political backlash should not be Merkel's European solution to the refugee crisis. And it's a pleasure to welcome Derek Scully. He's the Berlin correspondent of the Irish Times. He believes that Merkel won't be rewarded on Sunday for her refugee policies, and perhaps the first serious cracks will become apparent. But for want of an alternative, the CDU will not demolish their leader. And finally, our third guest, Wolfgang Merkel, is director of the Democracy and Democratization Research Unit at the Berlin Social Science Center. He says Chancellor Merkel's failure to coordinate her efforts has squandered European political capital and has contributed to the rise of a German political party that is both right-wing and populist. So welcome to all of you. Dilek Kurban, do you really think that the potential deal with Turkey is driven by domestic political considerations, as your opening statement claimed? Frankly, throughout the refugee crisis, Chancellor Merkel has been standing on principle to an extent rare in her political career.
That's true. At the beginning she did, and I think she deserves credit for that. Although, of course, maybe she should have first had agreement within the EU before declaring a new policy on the refugees. But then when we look at the past couple of months and her efforts to find a solution, it seems like her, she basically is seeking the answer in a deal with the Turkish government, which is seems to be exclusively on the terms of the Turkish government. And she made the mistake of letting the Turkish government set the terms and linking the refugee deal with the EU accession process. And of course, the EU accession process is important for democracy and democratization in Turkey, but not on these terms.
We want to come back and take a closer look at the potential deal in just a moment. Derek Scully, you say voters in Sunday's local elections absolutely won't reward Chancellor Merkel for her refugee policies. But could this Turkey deal, potential Turkey deal, at least stanch the hemorrhaging away from the mainstream political parties?
Well, this is the question. I think Sunday is, on the surface, it's about the migration crisis. This is what everyone is worried about. But underneath, I think we're talking about, will short-termism or long-termism in politics be rewarded? Angela Merkel is playing a long game. She says only joined-up thinking will work. A pan-EU refugee deal, Turkey and NATO on board. And most Germans, about 70% of Germans in a poll last week said, we think that's right, but less than a third said, we think that's possible. So that's what we're dealing with now, what the ideal solution is and the possible solution. And I think voters are very insecure, and they're feeling that the German Chancellor, really, she's in Berlin, she's in her Chancellery, she isn't aware of what's happening in small towns that are dealing with thousands of refugees, and she's just out of touch.
But interestingly enough, the Chancellor's own approval rating had been trending downward this year, and in fact now, this week, is back up to its highest point for 2016. So does that tell us something?
I think she still has some goodwill among people, and she's saying to people, trust me. She's saying this most un-German of things. She's saying, I know I should have a plan. I'm a German. I should have a plan, but I don't have a plan. And if I give you a plan, it will collapse in 3 weeks. So trust me on this. So I think she's pretty much on her last card of trust that she can play. And these elections will see whether people are still prepared to give her the benefit of the doubt.
Mr. Merkel, I'd like to stay with the Turkey deal. You said that the Chancellor squandered European political capital by failing to coordinate better with others. But the fact is, who's around to coordinate with? Even her erstwhile ally, Austria, has now gone for a nationalistic closing the border solution. So given the realities of what she's dealing with, isn't this deal with Turkey perhaps the best she can get?
I don't think so. And I don't think so it was correct and right and politically wise that she first struck a deal with Turkey and not, let's say, with France. So she negotiated with Turkey, came to a deal, and then presented it more or less surprisingly to the other head of states of the European member states. And what she did not do very far-sighted was not to get France into the boat. And I think this is, for the perspective of the European Union, one of the biggest mistakes she did in this refugee crisis.
But frankly, France hasn't been particularly helpful. France itself has said they're going to take next to no refugees.
Yeah, because they have a good argument. They have a good argument. It was Merkel who opened the borders. And Merkel did not go immediately after the opening of the borders in September of the last year to the other heads of state and heads of government of the European member states and negotiated it and came to a kind of solution. What are we doing next? And now it's 6 months after, and still it's not clear who will contribute to solve this refugee crisis and who will not. And France have to be the most eminent ally to Germany and to the Chancellor, and she did nothing.
DDay Kurban, the Chancellor has said repeatedly that Turkey absolutely is the linchpin to getting the refugee numbers down and to making the process of migration orderly. Do you think that's right?
Well, I mean, it depends. I mean, do we want, if what she wants is to have the number of the refugees down at all costs, against international law, against international conventional refugees, European Court of Human Rights rulings, the European Convention on Human Rights, and the EU's own standards on human rights, then fine, yeah, she can cooperate with Turkey. But if European values still matter, then I think she should have thought better about this. But it seems like it's too late now.
Let's take a look at the proposed deal in order to see the degree to which the accusations you just made are founded. The proposed deal with Turkey, of course, is by no means signed, sealed and delivered. But let's take a look at how it's shaping up and what the trade-offs are.
It'll be difficult to work out a compromise with Turkey, but rising tensions in the EU may prove even more difficult to deal with. Chancellor Merkel wants to do a deal with Ankara to sharply reduce the number of refugees, but that deal will be expensive. Turkey is ready to make some concessions, but has also made a number of demands. Turkish Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu wants more money, visa-free travel for Turks, and new talks on Turkey's bid to join the EU. In return, Turkey would take back migrants who don't qualify for asylum in the EU, and the EU would resettle one Syrian refugee from Turkey for each one forced to return there. Turkey has been criticized for seizing control of a big opposition newspaper last week and for its ongoing conflict with the Kurds. But the EU needs Turkey now more than ever. Is the Turkey-EU deal really a fair one?
Fair, of course, can mean many things. DDay Kurban, you sit on the EU Commission's independent network of experts. If they came to you for advice, what would you tell them? Would you say, listen, you're betraying your principles, this is not a fair deal?
I mean, the Commission is on anti-discrimination, the expert network. But anyway, I mean, what I would say is what I have been saying all along over the years. It is not fair. I mean, when you read the statement, first of all, you know, there's only one reference to media, and they say they discuss the situation of the media. It's not even media freedom. The situation of the media was discussed. I mean, the EU leaders could have done much better, at least to add something about, they expressed their concern about media freedom in Turkey.
Given the fact that Turkey has just shut down a major newspaper.
Right, sure. And then the question is, I mean, who's going to make the determination in terms of the eligibility for asylum. Turkey has a geographical reservation to the Geneva Convention on refugees, doesn't consider anybody who comes from east of Turkey, countries to the east of Turkey, as refugees. Only 10% of refugees in Turkey are in refugee camps. There are reports of exploitation of Syrian children who are working in sweatshops. Their schooling rates are very, very low. And of course, for example, will Turkey be fair towards, say, the Kurdish refugees from Syria in terms of selecting those that will be sent to Europe? I mean, there are just so many concerns here, and we will see, of course, how they'll be laid out. But it just the treatment of refugees cannot be left to Turkey. And one reminder: the collective expulsion of refugees is against the European Convention on Human Rights. There are specific court rulings on this.
Derek Scully, the fact is, though, Turkey has taken in more Syrian refugees than any other country, more than 2 million Syrians there at the moment. And as I said, the Chancellor has repeatedly said, look, we have to deal with Turkey in order to get this problem under control. If we emphasize the defects of this agreement, aren't we, in a sense, making the perfect the enemy of the at least okay?
Yes, this is the problem. No matter what way Merkel acts, somebody is always saying this is not the perfect deal. She, as you said, brought people in from Hungary during the summer, and that gave other people in Europe a chance to sit on their hands and say, well, you did this, you broke this, you fixed this. And now with Turkey, because there's so little coordination in the European Union, Merkel feels she has to go and deal with what critics here would say is dealing with a political devil who has just cracked down on fellow journalists. So from the German perspective, they say, well, who's helping us? We are trying to do something. This is absolutely not ideal, and Merkel herself is no friend of the Turkish president. He despises the woman because she does not believe Turkey belongs in the EU. So, I mean, the cynicism of the deal in one respect is clear, and the moral questionability of it is clear, but the Germans are saying, well, I see to the west nobody working with me, and so I'm looking to the east. So I have grave doubts about it, but I don't really know what else anyone else in Europe is doing. Everyone is condemning this deal, but I have yet to see what other alternatives were on the table. But of course, Merkel did go ahead and, like in the euro crisis, does deals and then expects people to sign off on it, which gives them another excuse to raise objections without proposing alternatives.
Isn't there something to that argument? Look, there aren't really very many good alternatives out there.
I do agree. We have to strike a deal, or the European Union has to come to an agreement with Turkey. I literally share each of your critical points with regard to the Erdogan government. However, politics is more than principles and moral. And we have, or the democracies have to negotiate and to deal with dictatorships or grey zone regimes like Turkey as well. They negotiate with China. They negotiate with Russia. The problem I see is that she is relying too much on Turkey, and I also see a problem in the sequence of negotiations. She should have come first to an agreement with the most relevant and important member states of the European Union, and then negotiate it with Turkey. I don't see that, for example, Great Britain, France, even Italy will accept these famous contingents. They will not take...
Let's briefly just explain what that is. The contingents, of course, are the resettled refugees they're supposed to take from Turkey. For every refugee who is sent back to Turkey from Greece,
even more.
The EU is supposed to take legal contingents from Turkey.
Yeah, but they have to come then to a common understanding how many, for example, how many refugees Ireland will accept and how many France will accept. And whatever formula you can think of for distributing the refugees, most of the countries, and not only the no-sayers from Eastern Europe, but the major countries, will not accept a fair share of these refugees. And this is something Merkel was on the wrong way.
But she also has no leverage. The reason why German federal states are accepting refugees is because they're legally obliged to. If Bavaria could get out of accepting any, I'm sure it would. In the Euro crisis, Germany had a checkbook as leverage. That concentrated minds. And I think Germany's realising two things. Number one, we actually have no political leverage. If a country like Ireland can get away with this for as long as possible with accepting no refugees at will. And secondly, the goodwill account towards Germany, I think, around Europe is rather empty. 5 years ago, I asked German politicians here, do you have to strike this tone of doing your homework in the crisis? Surely, yes. Eventually, Germany will need a favour one day, and I think Germany needs a favour now, and I wonder how many politicians around Europe are saying, yeah, schadenfreude, it's a lovely German word, delight at other people's misery. And I think that's, unfortunately, the position we find ourselves in now.
DDay Kurban, leaving aside the moral and international legal considerations that you raised, do you think that this deal is a workable way to bring the refugee numbers down?
Well, I mean, whether it's workable or not will have to be seen. I mean, as I said, there are certain concerns who's going to make the decision, for example, in terms of who will get in or not. But I still want to say, I mean, Turkey is not China. We're talking about an EU accession country. I mean, if Germany, if we're going to basically disregard this whole Copenhagen political criteria, that's fine, right? But it's just everyone is they're playing a game here.
Isn't it largely
we know
symbolic,
that Turkey,
though? The promise to open more of what's called accession chapters, isn't it largely symbolic? Behind closed doors, everybody says, hey, look, we know Turkey's not going to be a member anytime soon.
Exactly, it's a game. But it has consequences for what's going on in Turkey. We are paying the price of this whole game that's being played.
But
just because Merkel wants to be elected, I mean, you know, she doesn't want to lose votes, I understand that, but she cannot do that at the expense of further strengthening an illiberal regime and giving legitimacy to Erdogan's new Turkey. People are paying price for that in Turkey.
But Wolfgang Merkel, haven't we seen in the case of other countries that aspired to EU membership that holding out that promise actually can help push democratization along?
Yeah, but I would argue these were easier cases than Turkey. It was not that difficult to establish a democracy in Poland, in Czech, and even in the Slovak Republic. We are not talking about Bulgaria and Romania. And I think your Copenhagen criteria, meaning that these countries have to fulfill certain democratic standards, they never fulfilled these standards. And what we have seen during these accession treaties with Turkey is not an increase of the democratic structure and culture of this country. We have seen a decline of democratic quality of those who are in government. So I'm a bit skeptical that Turkey will be the next Czech case, so to say.
Derek Scully, there's another benefit that this deal would give to Turkey if the deal, in fact, does come about, and that is visa-free travel to Europe. Now, that is a sure vote-getter for Erdogan, but is it a vote-getter here in Europe? Do you think that many German voters, for example, would be welcoming the idea of 75 million Turks being able to travel to the border-free Schengen area?
The way the atmosphere is at the moment, things are so het up ahead of these three state elections. The answer is no. People are not thinking rationally. They're not thinking that there are well-educated Turks who should be coming and going. They just see more of what they've seen in the last 6 months, and they don't want any more of that. And this right-wing populist parties are playing on these fears, whether people are actually quite comfortable and they have nothing to be afraid of, but they're afraid somebody somewhere will be taking something from them, or if you're in Eastern Germany and you feel you haven't benefited economically in the last 25 years, they don't know foreign people. So to have the notion of more Turks coming, even if they're not planning on going to Eastern Germany, I don't see how that is going to be playing out here, because we're dealing with politics in Germany at Stammtisch, literally in the pub level, and the visa freedom for Turkey sounds like a bad idea.
Let's take a look at one of the right-wing parties that is playing on those fears about the wave of migration, the Alternative for Deutschland, AfD.
The Alternative for Germany party is on a roll. The right-wing populist party has taken a strong stand against the government's refugee policy and is playing on the fears of many Germans.
I've got a real problem with all this. The German government caused this crisis.
This can't go on forever. No country can keep taking in this many people.
Many in Eastern Germany feel the same way. So do a lot of middle-class voters in Western Germany. As Sunday's elections approach, the AFD may be on the verge of pulling double-digit numbers. Some analysts predict that the AFD may end up as the second strongest party in the state of Saxony-Anhalt. Is the AFD a dangerous political party?
Let me pass that question right on to you, Wolfgang Merkel. How worried are you about the rise of the AFD? We have seen right-wing populist parties rise to prominence before in Germany, the Republikaner, as they were called in the 90s, and then they fell apart, essentially, when they were confronted with the nuts and bolts of local policymaking.
I don't like this party. It's a nasty, right-wing, populist and xenophobic party. But they will not challenge democracy here in Germany. I would argue the German democracy is so well established that a party which may poll around 10 to 12% will not challenge the quality of democracy. One could even argue it's a kind of normalization, a kind of European normalization, because you have in almost all of the European member states strong and even stronger right-wing populist party. I don't like it, but it will not challenge German democracy.
I know you've advised SPD leaders in the state of Rhineland-Pfalz, Rhineland-Palatinate. It is one of the states that will be going to vote on Sunday. Interestingly enough, the CDU candidate there for premier of this state tried indirectly to capitalize on voters' fears about the Chancellor's refugee policy. She essentially came up with what she called a Plan B for migration, and it doesn't seem to have helped her at the polls.
No, I don't think, because she squandered some kind of credibility capital. Nobody really believed that she will distance from the Chancellor. And it looked like a kind of populist move to gain voters, was not very credible. And the plan, can you remember what she said? The plan itself was not something which could bring us to a solution. No, it was the wrong move of her.
DDay Kurban, the mainstream political parties are trying to tell us that, in fact, these state elections aren't really going to be a verdict on the governing coalition's refugee policies. How concerned are you about the outcome? And do you think, in the end, it is kind of D-Day for Merkel, as our title asks?
Well, I mean, the democracies have very basic rules and principles, right? And if a segment of the German population feel very concerned about, various policies, EU regarding EU, Euro, refugees, they do have the, right to represent them. And I think it's okay their voices too should be heard. But I think what needs to be done by Merkel and by everybody is also educate the German public about refugee rights and Germany's obligations under international law regarding refugees. They're not just by sort of like dumping refugees on sort of outside the EU's borders is not the solution. Just like excluding AFD or other parties out of the parliament is a solution. These need to be deliberated, talked about, discussed, but not by sort of very hastily adopted solutions, but sort of based on democratic principles and rules, I would say.
Derek Scally, rise of the AFD, a real threat for German democracy and for Chancellor Merkel?
I think they're only as strong as the mainstream parties in Germany are weak. I mean, as you said, we had this in the 90s, it died away. But what we didn't have in the 90s was social media and Facebook, this sort of echo chamber for idiocy. Anyone who has an opinion, no matter how ill-informed, will find people to share their opinion, and suddenly they're confirming each other. And I think that the German political parties have yet to deal with that. The AfD is far better at cheap tricks like provocation, but social media is cheap and effective, and I've yet to see the main parties here actually dealing with that. And until everyone feels they have a right to an uninformed opinion, until, as you said, informed opinion gets the upper hand and you actually talk about international law and obligations, the debate here is taking place on the terms of the AfD, and that's bad for German politics.
So I gather that none of you believe that these elections represent an imminent threat to the Chancellor remaining in office. But what about longer term, Wolfgang Merkel? Could the refugee crisis prove to be her make or break issue? Do you think she may wind up eventually leaving office because she failed to solve it?
No, I don't think so. It's not her character, and I don't see strong political parties which really can substitute the Christian Democratic Party. And she knows that still the majority of the German population cannot imagine another chancellor for the moment than her. So I think she will at least stay in power until the next election next fall, or the fall in 2017. And then it will depend on the coalition formula, and it will depend to some extent whether the European Union has found a solution of fair distribution of refugees and accepting and looking at the international legal obligation these states have agreed upon.
Many thanks. Thanks to all of you for being with us, and thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. See you soon.